Why was all this science ever allowed? Why was it ever let begin? Science is an enemy of everything that's natural in life.
And exploit all these giant possibilities of science that have been squandered hitherto upon war and senseless competition.
Is it any better world than it used to be? I rebel against this progress. What has this progress, this world civilization done for us? Machines.
Welcome to EIR Talks. This is Tony Pappert. It's Wednesday, April 7th, 1999, and with us in the studio is new Federalist Editor-in-Chief Nancy Spannaus. The subject of today's broadcast is things to come. We have wars girdling the globe today. In the Middle East, we've been fighting an undeclared war against Iraq for most of the past 9 years. In Africa, there are countless wars, or many wars, the largest probably being a war taking place in the Republic of Congo, where, among other things, the armies of 5 to 6 neighboring countries are engaged in an effort either to preserve or overthrow the government of Congo President Kabila. Neighboring Angola is in deepening civil war, as it has been for most of the past decade. In South America, Colombia is at war within its own borders. Again, a deepening war which has been going on for years. Now, with the unleashing of a new Balkans war by our sorry Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Vice President Al Gore, we have a new Iraq-style war in the very heart of Europe, neighboring 5 other European countries. Now, for the characters of these wars, and this will be a subject throughout our show, look at this undeclared war against Iraq. As we sit here today, U.S. and British planes are taking off virtually daily for apparently aimless bombing runs on Iraq, hitting such targets as oil pumping stations and other targets of opportunity. The more serious for the Iraqis, there has been an embargo on Iraq for the entirety of the past 9 years, which has doomed its growing young generation to malnutrition and doomed a substantial proportion of them to lifelong stunting and mental underdevelopment because of the effects of malnutrition in childhood. And these were people who hadn't yet been born when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, which is supposedly somehow the reason for the whole exercise. Now we're repeating a similar exercise in the Balkans. This is not war in the classic sense of Clausewitz or the American Revolutionary War or the American Civil War. It's not war in the sense that the government mobilizes the citizenry on behalf of a clear moral purpose. There is no other resort. Every other resort has been cut off. The citizenry mobilizes itself for a great moral effort, for a moral, winnable objective, and goes to war as we did in World War II. This is not that kind. These are not that kind of war at all. This is war where there's no definite meaning of victory. They're wars which go on indefinitely. Nobody can say when they're going to end. And they're wars which, and you'll see this increasingly, they're wars which involve, on the one hand, ultra-modern Tomahawk missiles, other kinds of ultra-modern so-called intelligent weaponry, and on the other hand, they involve a rock to the skull, a stick to the back of the head, and not just modern armies fighting, but neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother. So we have the world covered by these kinds of wars, if you could look at it this way from outer space. They're not all small wars by any means. They're not yet as big as World War II or World War I. But if these wars unite themselves in one general conflagration, it will be a kind of World War III which we've not seen on this planet since the 17th century. A war of all against all with no end. Now, Nancy, you've been studying the British New Dark Ages faction of the 19th and 20th century. Is there a plan behind all these wars and warfare?
It's quite eerie, Tony, when you go back and you look at the grouping that were the publicists for the British imperialists at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And you look particularly at people like in the Fabian Society, people in the Coefficients Club like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, Lord Bertrand Russell. And you see that they had a plan for reorganizing the world that would permit permanent control by their class, by Bertrand Russell's class. Wells was a commoner, but that would allow them to control through mind control, through drugs, through culture, the entire power over the universe. And they wrote about it quite openly. They said there was a faction around Ruskin in the late 19th century that openly said we want to go back to a new dark age. But these characters ostensibly wanted human progress, and they talked about human progress, but they actually wrote, and more than wrote, propagandized and manipulated a whole layer of culture and popular entertainment and drugs and all sorts of other artifacts which have shaped our culture today to create a kind of situation that we're facing now at the end of the 20th century. Lyndon LaRouche has often said in the last few years that you can't understand the shift that the United States in particular has gone through since the Kennedy assassination without understanding H.G. Wells. He wrote an article at the end of 1997 called The Wells of Doom, which is something that I looked at just recently again, and it's absolutely eerie that the ideas that were being written in 1896, 1913, 1933 are the ideas that people think they come up with by themselves. They think that they are for denying technology to the third world because something happened. It's not because of that. It's because these ideas were put into circulation. They've been surrounded by them in culture over this period.
Who really was H.G. Wells? I mean, most of our readers, listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with his name.
He was I think he was a middle-class Briton who made a name for himself writing science fiction novels in the 1890s. One of them people in the United States became very familiar with in the late 1930s, called War of the Worlds, when it was broadcast on radio and people thought we were being invaded from Mars. He wrote quite grisly science fiction movies, and but then was picked up in a more serious way in the early part of the 20th century and began to write more what you would call scenarios. What we're going to look at today, this movie Things to Come, which Wells was involved personally in producing in 1933, came from a book that he wrote called Shape of Things to Come, which he did in earlier in the 30s, and was an attempt to rationally lay out how a one-world government would come into being. It flopped. I mean, one thing that Wells did is he made his money by writing, so he would write these long things that would be serialized and he would make money. But so in this case it was very long and it didn't work. So he did this, hooked up with a fellow here in the United States called Alex Korda, and fortunately the movie, which was shown in the late 1930s, it was done in 1936, is in the public domain, so we are able to actually take a look at sections of it, and people can begin to get the idea of what was set into motion here. Now, a couple other things about Wells. Those who do know him, conspiracy buffs and so forth, will know him as the man who wrote a whole one-world government manifesto in the early part of the century.
The Open Conspiracy.
Open Conspiracy, yes. And this is soup to nuts. It's eliminate sovereign governments, population control, and all the way down the line. The second thing he did that is less well known, I believe, is in 1913, he wrote a monograph saying, well, mankind is developing a new technology. It's nuclear technology. We can foresee a time when we can bring mankind under control with limited nuclear wars. And in fact, this concept, where he was tied into the leading edge of British science at the time and was aware of the fact that nuclear energy was being developed, was something that was evolved into what people today would know as Dr. Strangelove in the movie of the 1960s, was it? Yes. The man who was the model for Dr. Strangelove, Dr. Leo Szilard, was actually a protege of H.G. Wells. And he didn't come up with this idea on his own. And the idea, if people are not familiar, is literally what's being discussed in strategic circles today. That if this process of endless war, which you were discussing, gets to the point where it's the United States against the other nuclear superpower, which is Russia still, then we could make a deal. And the deal could be, well, we knock off one of your cities with nuclear weapons, and you knock off one of ours, and say 50 million people die, but that it will blow off steam, and we'll have a modus vivendi, and we'll be able to proceed. Now, I'm not saying that it would happen that way, and this is a utopian concept that the British Empire has. But you get the idea of the maniacal willingness to see a devastation of human life and civilization that these characters have in hopes of being able to maintain control after the catastrophe has actually happened. Not that that would happen, in fact. LaRouche has often pointed out in the recent period, too, they're really, and as we can see by the demise of the United Nations in some respects, this idea of having a one-world government which can contain any kind of conflict is really passé. You're either going to have a total degeneration into barbarism, or you're going to have the kind of proposals of sovereign nation cooperation that Lyndon LaRouche has put forward in his New Bretton Woods proposals, and which call for the alliance of China, Russia, and the United States, bringing in other sovereign nations to actually begin to rebuild the world. So the only way you can really understand this war process is to understand that it's being orchestrated, not fingertip control, but in broad control of the strategic thinking of policymakers and your strategic thinking by a British-American Commonwealth faction, the inheritors of H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell's ideas. Now, I want to review, and we'll show a few clips of the Things to Come movie, because I think it will underscore the point we're making, with people having to recall that this was done in 1933. It was prior to the Second World War. And obviously, people in Britain were aware that they were headed toward a war with Germany, but this had not yet happened. And none of our modern civilization. This does not feature nuclear war, but it does feature other aspects of what we actually see going on right now. So the movie opens in 1940, at which point, right before bombs begin to fall on a place called Everytown, which is clearly London. And what is, there's a little debate between the characters who were there, and they say, well, is this war going to be good for us? The way many stupid Americans and others say today, well, gee, a war would be good, we can get our industry started again. Or the British say, when they want to get their enemies fighting, let's have a splendid little war in the colonies. But so one side is that, the other side says, well, this may not be the same this time. This time, when we have war, is there a concept of victory, as you were saying? What will happen? And what proceeds over the next good 15 minutes or so of the movie is a process, you see a process of endless war. And the war in the movie goes on from 1940 to 1965.
Editor-in-Chief Nancy Spannaus. The subject of today's broadcast is things to come. We have wars girdling the globe today. In the Middle East, we've been fighting an undeclared war against Iraq for most of the past 9 years. In Africa,
Giant possibilities of science that have been squandered hitherto upon war and senseless competition.
Is it any better world than it used to be? I rebel against this progress. What has this progress, this world civilization done for us? Machines.
Welcome to EIR Talks. This is Tony Pappert. It's Wednesday, April 7th, 1999, and with us in the studio is New Federalist.
Why was all this science ever allowed? Why was it ever let begin? Science is an enemy of everything that's natural in life.
And exploit all these...
There are countless wars, or many wars, the largest probably being a war taking place in the Republic of Congo, where, among other things, the armies of 5 to 6 neighboring countries are engaged in an effort either to preserve or overthrow the government of Congo President Kabila. Neighboring